Hi there, my name is Phil Irvin. I am Director of Marketing and Communications at the Saint Paul Seminary and honored and privileged to be joined today by Bishop Cozzens, Bishop Andrew Cozzens of the Diocese of Crookston, Minnesota, also appointed by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops to lead the National Eucharistic Revival. Bishop, thank you so much for taking some time out of your very busy schedule to chat with us today.
I'm delighted to be with you, Phil, and grateful for the work of the St. Paul Seminary.
Well, thank you. It's an honor to be a part of it. Um, to start, let's talk about you. You're well into year two as Bishop of Crookston, Minnesota. How are things going out there in the land of 10,000 lakes so far?
It's a beautiful place to be a bishop. It's quite a transition, quite a change from my life. As you know, I was living at the St. Paul Seminary as auxiliary bishop in the Twin Cities, and the life of the Archdiocese of St. Paul, Minneapolis had its own beautiful flavor to it and busyness. And the life of a diocesan bishop is somewhat different. You're in charge for one, so you have to make all the decisions, and not just assisting as I was before. But also, the Diocese of Crookston is pretty spread out. We are 14 counties, 17,000 square miles, 66 parishes across the whole northwestern part of Minnesota. So if you think of Minnesota, the top third of Minnesota is split between Crookston on the western side and Duluth on the eastern side. And so we go from Fargo, Moorhead area, Moorhead's in my diocese, all the way up to Lake of the Woods. So we've got really beautiful people, a combination of kind of industry and rural life, and 66 churches across there, 34 priests caring for those churches. So it's really a beautiful place. I have put a lot of miles on my car this year. I think 35,000 I put on the first year, and
Oh my!
it continues to go. I've put on almost 10 or 15,000 at this point in this year. So it
What kind of
continues to
car do they
go.
let you have? What kind of car do they let you have? Hopefully, it's
I'm
got good
still
fuel.
driving my Ford Escape that I had in the Twin Cities. I'm just keep
It
putting more
works.
miles on it. It runs great.
Good. It is a beautiful part of the country and a part of the state, especially this time of year. We're actually recording this on the feast of Our Lady of Fatima, so happy feast day of Our Lady of Fatima. And yeah, always excited when summer finally rolls around in Minnesota, especially up north where you're at.
It is beautiful, and it's a great time to be outdoors. We have Lake Itasca State Park, the largest of the state parks, is in my diocese, and the headwaters of the Mississippi, and many beautiful lakes, and as well as lots of beautiful farmland.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, speaking of beautiful things, let's talk about the National Eucharistic Revival here in the United States. Just a quick intro to what it is and why we're doing it for viewers or listeners who maybe aren't as familiar with it.
Yeah, the National Eucharistic Revival is a program that was started by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, really to help lift up the importance of and strengthen Eucharistic belief in the Church in the United States. And we chose that word revival on purpose because it really means we want to revivify, to bring life back to the church. And we know that the Eucharist is the very heart of the church. And so it's one of the things the bishops have come together on to say, no, given where we are in terms of the Eucharistic belief of people and given the needs of the Church of the United States right now, we want this movement to help strengthen and unify our church by really inviting people to a deeper relationship with Jesus in the Eucharist so that they can experience healing and conversion and also formation, and mainly so that they can become missionaries. And so it really is a kind of evangelistic movement to try to help the average Catholic deepen their own encounter with Jesus in the Eucharist and then be sent on mission to help share that good news with others. It's a 3-year movement that began this year, which we're still coming just to the end of the first year, this diocesan year, where we've really focused on leaders. And the second year is going to really focus on parishes and trying to get to the grassroots, to the people in the parishes, especially those people who maybe have some liminal connection to the church, but need to grow in that. And then that year will end with the National Eucharistic Congress. We can talk more about that. And then the missionary year.
Yeah, beautiful. How would you say it's going so far here as year one wraps down? What tangible steps have been taken, and what fruit have you seen from your chair so far?
It's been beautiful to see the incredible collaboration amongst bishops, apostolates, Catholic media outlets, basically all people who love the Eucharist. It's been
Yeah.
beautiful to see the creativity of everyone coming together and to hear the national conversation about how is it best to do this kind of Eucharistic revival and why it's important. And to see the creativity of the witnesses and testimony. You can see a lot of this if you go to our website, eucharisticrevival.org, and sign up for our newsletter where you can kind of follow the heart of the revival to get more information. But we have thousands of people interceding, and we have a prayer team. You can sign up on our website to be a member of that prayer team. Literally, we have thousands of members of that prayer team who are interceding constantly every week for this revival in our country. And we have also just had incredible events all throughout this year to really kind of engage and train and form leaders. It's funny, I was in Florian, Minnesota this morning, which is a little town and a little church in the middle of a cornfield. This old Polish guy comes up to me and he says, I love what you're doing with that revival. I watched your whole course on revived parishes and I learned so much. There's so much on that website, he said. So when we're reaching the old Polish farmers in Florian, Minnesota, you're starting to get to the grassroots. So it's
Yeah,
very
absolutely.
exciting.
You're casting the right net. We will definitely include a link to the National Eucharistic Revival website, as well as some of those resources Bishop's talking about in the description here. So make sure you, the viewer or listener, scroll down, click read more, and check some of that out. I am on the newsletter list as well, and I can vouch for it. It is fantastic, really good, just kind of wholesome spiritual inspiration and guidance around the Eucharist, and then insight to everything that's going on with the revival. You've got kind of a pretty rock solid team behind you doing a lot of this work too. It seems like, from things like that newsletter and kind of other touch points that have been out there so far.
Yeah, we got really good people. We really two teams now. So there's the whole team running the revival at the USCCB. And then there's the team which is running the National Eucharistic Congress,
Sure.
which will be next summer. Maybe
Yeah,
just to
tell
say,
us.
yeah.
Sorry to cut you off. Tell us more about that, and some of the events leading up to it too. I've heard exciting rumblings, but what can you tell us as kind of a teaser for 2024?
Yeah, so this is going to be the 10th National Eucharistic Congress in our country. The ninth one was in 1941, actually in St. Paul, Minnesota. And that day, 80,000 people processed from the Cathedral of St. Paul to the state fairgrounds in the rain and had
Wow.
all night adoration at the state fairgrounds in St. Paul, Minnesota. So we have a beautiful part of that history. And I've met people who were there, so it's a beautiful thing. The uh, but the last kind of Eucharistic Congress of this size was in 1976 when we had an International Eucharistic Congress in Philadelphia. An unknown Polish Archbishop named Karol Wojtyła was on the stage at that event next to Mother Teresa of Calcutta, who were both there. And they had really hundreds of thousands of people came together in Philadelphia to celebrate the gift of the Eucharist then. And we've decided to relaunch this movement of National Eucharistic Congresses, which seemed to stop at World War II. There was several of them in the beginning of the 20th century, both in Cincinnati and in New Orleans and in Chicago, an International Eucharistic Congress, then in St. Paul. And really, all of them had around 100,000 people. The Chicago one was also huge in terms of almost 1 million people for the closing Mass. And there was really a lot of beautiful movement there. And we've decided to relaunch that movement by having the 10th National Eucharistic Congress. We hope to gather 75,000 people in Indianapolis, maybe 100,000 people. It's going to be really a gathering of the church. And it'll be 4 nights. We'll begin on Wednesday evening in Lucas Oil Stadium. And the evenings will be beautiful programming in the stadium for everybody together. We'll have adoration every night. We'll have incredible Catholic speakers. You name them, they're going to be there. Father Mike Schmitz, Bishop Barron, Sister Miriam James is one of our hosts for it. Father Josh Johnson's one of our hosts. We really have an incredible lineup of speakers. And the mornings will be large catechetical sessions with large masses, and the afternoons will be small breakouts, and just kind of a festival atmosphere. We've got, incredible musicians like Matt Maher, and we're hoping to get the Indianapolis Symphony for the closing Mass. It's
Wow.
going to be really a gathering of the U.S. Church that we hope will inspire people to make that missionary conversion going home, to take home this great encounter that they have with Jesus in the Eucharist. But then you're right, leading up to it, we have a whole plan, which is the National Eucharistic Pilgrimage. We're going to pilgrimage with Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament across our country, beginning in California at San Francisco, beginning at and the East Coast at in Connecticut at the tomb of Saint Michael McGivney, Blessed Michael McGivney, beginning at Brownsville, Texas, at the border, and beginning the northern route at Lake Itasca State Park, the headwaters of the Mississippi.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
your backyard. Wow.
exactly. And we're going to walk as much as we're able. We'll do some driving, but we'll have Eucharistic processions all the way along on those 4 routes as they converge on Indianapolis for July 17 to 21, 2024 for the 10th National Eucharistic Congress. So those processions will begin the weekend of like May 17 to 19. And we're going to begin in northern Minnesota with a small, regional event at Bemidji, but we're hoping to get about 4,000 people for that. And we do have Father Mike Schmitz and Bishop Barron lined up for that. So hoping to actually have a kind of kickoff event. And then we'll have a big mass, which all get to celebrate at Lake Itasca State Park on Pentecost 2024, so a year from now. And then we'll begin to walk with the Blessed Sacrament. We'll go over to Duluth. We'll come down through the Twin Cities. We'll go down through Rochester, down to La Crosse. We'll go over across to Green Bay. In fact, we're going to visit several Marian shrines along the way. So we're calling our route the Marian Route.
Wow.
And also because the Mississippi River, where it starts, was first named the River of the Immaculate Conception by the early Franciscan explorers. So it'll be a beautiful thing. They'll call the way down through Chicago and then down into Indianapolis.
Sounds incredible. I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it. Can't wait.
Yeah.
And I know there's a separate website for the Eucharistic Congress with a lot of this info too. So we'll be sure.
eucharisticcongress.org. And we're just getting the information out about the pilgrimages now, a year ahead. But we are going to be looking for young people who want to be missionaries, young adults who would be willing to walk along with Jesus for several weeks of that pilgrimage.
Well, what an opportunity. And like you said and pointed out eloquently, this isn't something that happens all the time, right? This will be a pretty historic deal, to say the least.
And for me, it's part of the praying for revival, right? As we go and process with our Lord and we pray and we walk and we pilgrimage together. And you can imagine us stopping in churches every night and having little programs there. It's really going to be praying for that revival of our Eucharistic faith in our country.
So good. Shift just a little bit. In your view, Bishop, what role do seminaries in particular have when it comes to renewing faith in the true presence of Jesus in the Eucharist?
An essential role. The seminaries are the heart of the church always, because the seminary is that seedbed where the priests come from. That's what the word seminary means. It means seedbed, And really, the priests, the seminarians, as they're in the seminary, need to develop that intimate relationship with Jesus in the Eucharist, because it's that relationship with Jesus in the Eucharist that actually transforms and sustains and really gives the whole kind of understanding to a priestly vocation. You can't understand the priesthood apart from the Eucharist. They were created together at the Last Supper, and they in a certain way form one mystery, which is Jesus making himself present for the life of the world. And the priest, his whole life is kind of marked by the daily celebration of the Eucharist and by the transformation that's happening in him. And he learns who he is from the Eucharist, right? And so seminarians need to learn this. The priest learns that I'm to be given for the sake of my people. This is what Jesus says in the Eucharist. This is my body given up for you. This is my blood poured out for you. And this is what the priest learns as he daily celebrates the Eucharist, how he is to be given, how he is to be poured out, how his life exists for the sake of God's people. And this is what Jesus wants to teach us in the Eucharist. And really, it's in the seminary that priests learn this. And such a beautiful thing that you see this tendency in seminaries of a daily Eucharistic Holy Hour, as we have at Saint Paul Seminary. I used to join the seminarians every morning when I was there, living in residence at the seminary. And that experience of spending time with Jesus in silence, so important. And the experience of the daily celebration of the Mass. And then, of course, all the study. Really, it's the Eucharist that is the source of what we call the pastoral charity of the priest. That's the love of the Good Shepherd. And as the seminarian is drawn into Jesus in the Eucharist, then he's able to make present that love of the Good Shepherd. And so the Eucharistic revival begins with seminaries, right? If our priests are not on fire with Eucharistic love, our people will not be. And so this is where the future of the church means that this revival will be stoked and carried on for many years.
Sure. Now, it's obviously a profound mystery. It's hard to discuss in little bite-sized chunks, but can you break down some proofs, or just kind of ways to talk about how Jesus is actually truly present, that we can, as lay people, effectively share with others, whether that's fellow Catholics or non-Catholics, just kind of those within our communities?
Yeah, there's different ways to talk about it. I think the best way is to talk about it in terms of what's found in Scripture. So, first off, John chapter 6, where the Lord actually explains how he gives his flesh and blood for the life of the world. And what you begin to understand, especially in John's gospel, is this whole understanding of that word life. When John uses that word in the gospel, in Greek, he doesn't use the word bios, which would be like human or ordinary life. He uses the word zoe, which is God's life, the life of grace, the eternal life of God that comes to us through the sacraments. We receive it in baptism, and it's strengthened every time we receive the Eucharist in Holy Communion. And that's what he's talking about when he says, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you do not have life in you. And so really we receive the life of God through the Eucharist, through his flesh and blood. And that's what sustains us and keeps us going. And then, the other place, of course, is the Last Supper discourse, and those times at the Last Supper where the Lord speaks about the gift of the Eucharist. So when he says, take this, all of you, and eat it, this is my body given up for you, this is my blood poured out for you. And then, you can read commentaries from every century on those words. I could take you all the way back to St. Ignatius of Antioch in the 1st century, or St. Irenaeus in the 2nd century, or St. Cyprian in the 3rd century. They all speak about it with one voice, that when Jesus said that, he was not speaking symbolically. Jesus is God and his word is true. And he says, this is my body. In fact, the bread becomes his body. And it's St. Ambrose who said, isn't the one who's capable of turning water into wine capable of turning bread into his own body and blood, right? And St. Thomas Aquinas, when he commentates on it, he says, he says, all the other senses are indeed deceived, because our senses cannot pick up the change that happens, because the change happens on a deeper level, a real level, and really on the level of the being of the bread, right? So not just spiritual change, but a real level. The bread is really transformed. It's just the perceptible senses remain the same. So those things which are perceivable to the senses, which are the properties of the bread, they're unchanged, which makes the change we call transubstantiation, the change of the substance or the essence of the thing, different from any other change we know, because every other change, when you see it, it affects the senses, right? But this change, the things that are perceived by the senses remain the same. What changes is the essence. And so the Council of Trent will say, there's no more bread there. There's no more wine there. What is there? The body, the blood, which is what Jesus says is there. And then wherever his body and blood is found, his soul and divinity is found. That is Jesus himself, and all that Jesus is found there. That's the change we call transubstantiation. The substance, the essence of the bread, becomes the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus. But I love the way St. Thomas says it. He says, all our other senses are in this deceived. So I can't see it, can't hear it, can't smell it, can't taste it. What says trustee hearing? It shall be believed. And hearing, of course, says, this is my body. And then he says, truth himself speaks truly, or there's nothing true. Jesus is truth himself. And if Jesus says this is his body, it's his body. And of course, here you automatically see the power of the priesthood. Because Jesus, when he says, do this in memory of me, gives his apostles and their successors the power to do what he did, which is to say, this is my body, and have it become the body and blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus. It's hard to imagine actually a greater miracle than this. It's hard to imagine how Jesus could come any closer to us except coming to us as our food. And so we see the great beauty of the mystery that he gives us in this, his most august gift.
Amazing. Thanks for laying all that out. That's
course,
So
I learned all
beautiful.
this when I was teaching Eucharist at St. Paul Seminary.
Yeah, yeah,
I learned
yeah.
it before,
Sounds
but
like
I
you've
taught
answered
this
this
many
question
times.
before.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And when I was in the seminary, I used to always insist that the Eucharist class happen right before Mass every day. So beautiful, because we would
Sure.
study the Eucharist and then we would all go right to Mass and celebrate the Eucharist. And so it was a great way to see the way our study informed and deepened our faith.
Ah, so good. We have some great Eucharistic patrons that we're able to look to too. You mentioned Blessed Michael McGivney. Can you tell us about him? Guys like Blessed Carlo Acutis, who's another patron of the revival. Just kind of other Eucharistic patrons that we can kind of draw strength and inspiration from when we're reflecting on Jesus' presence in the Eucharist.
Well, it's kind of interesting because you can't be a saint and not love the Eucharist, right? The Eucharist, as Vatican II said, contains the entire spiritual wealth of the church, which is Christ himself. And so every saint has a deep devotion to the Eucharist. And Blessed Michael McGivney, he was a parish priest. That's one of the great things about him. He founded the Knights of Columbus, and that's what he's most famous for. But he was a parish priest who daily celebrated the Eucharist, loved the Eucharist, taught his people to love the Eucharist, and understood that it was going to be by drawing his people into relationship with Jesus in the Eucharist that they would be strengthened, formed, and be able to be who they're supposed to be in the world. Blessed Carlo Acutis, though, has kind of taken the world by storm. So here's a Gen Z. I think he's Gen Z teenager. He would be 25 or something like that today if he were alive.
Yeah.
And he is he played video games with moderation, but he played them. He had a website which he built to promote Eucharistic miracles. He was taken by the Eucharist, even though his family was not practicing, and so taken by it that he started going to daily Mass and brought his whole family back to church, and then built a website to try to promote understanding of the Eucharist through Eucharistic miracles. And then when he came down with cancer as a 15-year-old, he offered that cancer for the church and for priests, and really continued that deep daily relationship with the Eucharist until he died. And he's buried in Assisi, and his mom's still alive. Who's a saint that's mom's still alive? And he
Right.
wore Nike tennis shoes. I keep thinking should get Nike to sponsor the Eucharistic Congress, because Blessed Carlo Acutis wore Nike tennis shoes.
Great
But
idea. Still
he's
nice
just
to
an
get
incredible
behind that.
inspiration. We'll see. He's an incredible inspiration, though, for young people. What a young person could do who's on fire for love of the Eucharist.
It's awesome. You mentioned Eucharistic miracles. Do you have a favorite Eucharistic miracle or two from which you personally
Yeah,
find
so
inspiration
there
and
is
strength?
one there's one that's very recent, which Pope Francis himself approved when he was the Archbishop of Argentina. He studied it and approved it. And it was a host that had fallen to the ground, and they put it in water and they put it in the tabernacle, which is what you normally do, and let the host decompose. Once it decomposes, then you bury it out of reverence.
Sure.
But it didn't just decompose, it turned into heart muscle. And when they brought it to the scientist to investigate it, he put it under and it was a medical doctor. He said, "Well, this is a piece of someone's heart, and it's a piece of heart that has undergone trauma."
Mm.
And gave the blood type for it, all these things. And then they told him afterwards, it's not a piece of heart. It was a consecrated host that was put in water. And so Pope Francis himself, as the Archbishop of Argentina, approved that as an authentic Eucharistic miracle. My other favorite one, though, you can still see in Siena, Italy. And what happened there was somebody stole a bunch of hosts from the tabernacle once. And this was like in the 1600s. They stole the hosts, and they wanted the gold container the hosts were in. So they took the host to another church and put the consecrated host into the poor box and took the gold container. And it was a big scandal in town. The tabernacle had been broken into, and the Catholic town was up in arms. And there was a priest who was praying in that other church, and he saw something white in the poor box. And he opened up and he found the consecrated host. And he realized what it was. So he carefully cleaned them and put them in a ciboria and called the bishop. And they had a big Eucharistic procession. The whole town turned out, processed the Blessed Sacrament back to the tabernacle from which it was stolen, and repaired the tabernacle and everything. And then left it in there, those hosts, thinking that they would decompose after time. Even regular hosts after some months will decompose if you don't put them in water. But they never decomposed. And first it was like 6 months, and then it was a year, then it was 5 years, then it was 10 years, then it was 100 years, and they've never decomposed. And in fact, they've tested them, they've tasted them. They say taste fresh. And they've tested them under microscopes to see, and it says the starch content is like fresh bread. It's now 200 years. And you can still go and have adoration with those hosts. They expose them once a week. I've been there in Siena to see that. It's really beautiful to see.
Wow, it's awesome. Have to add Siena to the Catholic pilgrimage bucket list for those who haven't.
It's great to see. It's a beautiful cathedral too.
That's awesome. Last one, and we'll get you out of here. I want you to go back in time a little bit. You've touched on some of your experiences working and living at the seminary post-ordination, but when you look at just kind of your vocation story and your time as a seminarian, what role did the Eucharist and adoration, et cetera, play in that journey to where you've come from today, to today?
Yeah, I don't remember a time when I did not believe in Jesus' real presence in the Eucharist. I think from a young kid, my parish priest, I remember him teaching me to genuflect as he was training me to be an altar server in the first grade. He pulled me out of my first grade class and had me make my first communion early, my first confession and first communion early, so I could serve Mass for him because he was going to retire from the parish. And he was training me to altar serve. And I remember him teaching me to genuflect and teaching me about the importance of reverencing Jesus in the tabernacle and the reverence during Mass. And so I always believed, and that was a big part of my own vocation story, was I loved so much serving Mass because I could be close to Jesus in the Eucharist, and always believed in Jesus in the Eucharist. And as my faith grew and as I grew up, I wanted to be close to Jesus in the Eucharist. And so even throughout seminary, that was really a big part of my vocation, was that daily relationship with Jesus in the Eucharist, and really learning the gift of self that's required to live that Eucharistic life. I do remember, though, as I was approaching ordination, I often tell this story because I had a scruple that happened to me my last year at the Saint Paul Seminary. And the scruple was this. I thought, I've always believed it was Jesus in the Eucharist when someone else consecrated the Eucharist. Will I believe when it's me who says those words, Yeah. Will I be able to believe? And I can honestly tell you, I celebrated my first Mass on Corpus Christi Sunday at the Cathedral in St. Paul, was ordained the day before there. And it's a very vivid memory for me, how I said those words for the very first time for myself. And then I held up Jesus and adored him, and I set him down on the altar, and then I genuflected. And I had no doubt I was genuflecting before the Lord of all the universe, and that he was really here. And that's, of course, the beauty of the faith of the Church, right? It carries you in those moments. So grateful to God. It was John Paul II who said, I was ordained a servant of the Eucharist. And I often experience that was my life too.
Amen. Going to be hard to top that. Thank you so much for the time, Bishop, and for the conversation. Bishop actually has to go do some confirmations. He's out there in Bemidji as we're having this conversation. So God bless all your confirmants out there and in the Crookston Diocese. And thanks for all the work you're doing and for a little bit of time again out of your busy schedule, Bishop.
You're welcome. God bless you, Phil, and God bless all the work of the St. Paul Seminary. So grateful for Father Taphorn and his team and the good work that's happening there, and grateful that we've got Crookston seminarians there at the St. Paul Seminary now. God bless.
That's right. We're glad to have them. Be sure to check out stpaulseminary.org as well as Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn for more information and content from the seminary. And one more reminder to check out the description of this video. We'll have plenty of info and resources on the Eucharistic Revival and Eucharistic Congress there. Thanks for watching or listening, and God bless.